everyone I think in this meeting is probably bothered by a lot of things, but certainly in the United States, politics and culture and everything else are bothering us. And this whole resurgence of conspiracy theory has bothered me a lot. And it was driven home, at least in the area of ontology, relatively recently, when I received a review of a proposal that I had submitted to the NIH, where one of the reviewers basically said, you don't need all this ontology stuff, you can just use generative AI. And I'm realizing that ontologies are not at the forefront of attention that I think they should be, certainly not where they were when many of us started in this field years ago. And I want to sort of tell you a story and also give you my impressions on some of the things I've been hearing over the years that I think as a community we need to be aware of and that we need to address. And hopefully I'll leave enough time that we can have a lot of discussion at the end and talk about whether these are real issues or whether these are just my paranoia. As you know, we've been working on Bioportal for a long time, and some of you actually have been involved in the Bioportal project. We started Bioportal in 2005. This is what it looks like right now. We show you how to get to ontologies. You can browse ontologies, you can search ontologies. We can see what ontologies are most popular. Still don't quite understand why last month there seemed to be a run on mesh. But in any event, you can get a sense for what people are doing in the ontology community, and you can use these ontologies in a variety of ways, both by browsing them and also through an API. Well, the Bioportal began about 20 years ago, and Bioportal began, I think, really with a lot of excitement. But let me tell you my sad story. My sad story was that 10 years ago, it was the end of the National Centers for Biomedical Ontology. That was the program at NIH that led us to create Bioportal in the first place. And this slide shows you what Bioportal looked like in 2015. And yeah, the UI is a lot more cluttered, and we don't like it anymore. That's why you saw the nice UI we developed more recently. But this is the UI that we showed at the very last meeting of our scientific advisory board for the Bioportal project when it was funded through this big NIH initiative. And we were very excited. We could show them the UI. At that time, we had 442 ontologies in Bioportal. We thought that was a big deal. Obviously, we now have over 1,200. But we were excited by our 442 ontologies. We were excited by having indexed a whole bunch of resources. We don't do that anymore for reasons we can talk about offline, with lots of direct annotations. And we were thrilled. We said, look, people are using Bioportal. It looked like every month we had on the order of 17,000 people doing page views. And 17,000 page views a month, we thought that was pretty good. We looked at the API hits, and we're just doing really exceptionally well in terms of the number of API hits Bioportal was getting 10 years ago. The thing was, we started this project putting ontologies online. We had no idea if we build it, will they come? We had no idea what the interest in Bioportal would be. And by the time we had our final SAB meeting in 2015, we felt like we were like McDonald's with billions and billions of people coming doing API calls and looking at our ontologies. We just thought that this was really wonderful. Maybe I was inflating myself. Maybe it was my own ego. And then we heard from our scientific advisory board. And they really deflated me more than any SAB has ever done in my career. Our SAB said, well, that's all really exciting, but now can you do something other than ontologies? And this really kind of blew me away. I thought we had just shown them how many people were coming to our site, how important ontologies were in the community. Their statement to me was, ontologies are going to go away, and you should find something else to do. And in some sense, they were right. When you look at Google Trends, and I'm not sure this is necessarily the most definitive source of information for us, but basically, since the time that Bioportal began around 2005 and the present, interest in ontology, at least if you look at searches, has certainly gone down over the years. And basically, during this time, I've heard lots of things from people in the community. that begin to echo what my SAB was telling me 10 years ago. I hear things which I think are kind of specious, but I think it's worth reviewing them because we as a community hear this all the time. We hear that ontologies are old-fashioned, that the languages we use to create ontologies are too complicated, that ontology engineering is just not an interesting problem. Ontologies coerce people to adopt very rigid worldviews. Generative AI obviates all the need for ontologies, and ontologies will just go away in the new AI world. I think all of these statements are false, but let's sort of review them one by one. I think in some sense it's our fault that we have a problem that people think ontologies are old-fashioned. I know that I, for one, every time I give a talk about ontologies, I always feel obligated to show a picture of Aristotle. I think that's probably a very bad idea. But I think we obviously need to be playing on how important ontologies are for knowledge graphs, for e-commerce, and for everything else that we use them for right now. But anyway, we certainly have this reputation to overcome. We get told that ontologies are too complicated. And admittedly, we've been spending the past 20 years just trying to define pizza. And I know that turns people off. I think we have to recognize that the language we use for ontologies are complicated enough to say the kinds of things that we want to say. But we also, as I'll say later, need to recognize that sometimes we can be saying things in a more simplified way to make them more attractive. And I think many of you may remember the language wars that occurred 10, 15 years ago when the biomedical ontology community was very doubtful of the need for complicated description logic representations. The description logic people were aghast that the biontology community thought that simple graphs were good enough. And I think we've moved well beyond those language wars, but it shows you that we still have work to do here. And this kills me. People tell me that ontology engineering is not an interesting problem. My feeling is that ontology engineering is one of the most interesting problems in informatics. From my perspective, what I really like about ontology engineering is that it gives us an opportunity to understand our world, to make models of the world, to understand the strengths and limitations of those models, and to understand how those models allow us to achieve the goals that we have in science. I feel a lot like Tom Lehrer did when he talked about new math in the 1960s. The whole idea in ontology engineering, from my perspective, is to understand what you're doing, not necessarily to get the right answer. And although modern AI can get us the right answer stunningly, really what ontology engineering offers us is the opportunity to understand the basis for the decisions that we make and the models of the world that we interpret. And at the same time, we know that ontology engineering can become extremely interesting when we combine more traditional knowledge engineering approaches with generative AI. And of course, there's a lot of discussion of that topic at this conference here. But it really drives me nuts that a lot of people have simply said we need to move away from ontology engineering just because it's not as interesting as it might have seemed 20 years ago. And then there's the argument I hear all the time that ontologies coerce people to adopt rigid worldviews. But most of us would argue that's exactly why we're in the ontology business, that we want worldviews to be rigid because we want to have representations of data that we understand, that we can search, that are reproducible. But this is a real issue, and it really was driven home to me 4 years ago when I was asked to serve on a committee for the National Academies that was looking at ontologies in the behavioral sciences. This was a committee that was convened by a lot of sponsors, the NIH, the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatry Association, many groups who were concerned about behavioral science in particular as being an area of study where it was really needed to have strong ontologies. And why? Well, the committee had identified some problems. They said in experimental psychology, there's been an explosion of overlapping theory, and it's mainly because basically, if you want to get tenure in experimental psychology, so it was said, you have to have a new theory. You can't basically use someone else's theory. You can't just tack new ideas onto some existing theory. You have to come up with something that's totally original. And the lack of standard vocabulary has made it impossible to understand how one theory might relate to another. The lack of standard vocabularies made it impossible to relate theories to theories of behavior to advances in neuroscience. And so the behavioral scientists and the neuroscientists basically were working in completely siloed applications and couldn't talk to one another. And ultimately, the other problem, of course, is that everybody hates DSM-5. Diagnosis in clinical psychology is confused by the lack of consistent axiomatized nosology. We all know that. But what was really interesting to me was people were willing to acknowledge the fact that here was an entire discipline where ontology was needed because we needed to tame the cacophony of competing theories, which the culture had stimulated, because in order to succeed in psychology, you have to be completely different than the other guy. And it actually was a problem if your theory and someone else's theory actually seemed similar. So really, the committee was stuck. We had to deal with all kinds of concerns that ontologies constrain what people can think, and many psychologists were arguing that people should be able to think in an unconstrained, unrestricted manner. The development of new theories will always be difficult if they have to be expressed in terms of existing approved concepts. But on the other hand, we won't understand how theories relate to one another without that foundation. People complained that investigators who ignore ontologies really need to be more creative and can't be stuck in existing nomenclature. And that basically, if people want tenure, they have to have the freedom to do completely novel theorization without regard to what anybody else in the field has done. Basically, the argument was that behavioral science is just too complicated to comport with any ontology or taxonomy. And the committee really had a very tough time trying to overcome these concerns and show that ontology could actually have great benefits in behavioral science. And ultimately, they led to a conclusion which I think most of us coming to this meeting would agree with, that ontology development and use has the potential to move behavioral science forward from a domain in which research is generally siloed and data and results are often incompatible to one in which the evidence is searchable and more easily integrated, and in which computer technology is leveraged in the discovery of new relationships, the development of novel hypotheses, and the identification of knowledge gaps. And I think for all of us at this meeting, we don't need to say that this is only in the domain of behavioral science. I think all of science would benefit from ontology, and this statement is universally true in the sciences and probably in all of scholarship. So I keep on hearing this stuff, that ontologies are old-fashioned, that they're too complicated, that they're not interesting, that they coerce people to adopt rigid worldviews. And then what's coming up in spades right now is the idea that generative AI obviates the need for ontologies completely. And I'll argue that that's just not the case. We look at existing data, and I'm going to show you a sample of a data set taken from Biosample, one of the NCBI data sets. I won't claim this is completely selected at random, but you see a data set where we see the cell type is primary cell. What does that mean? The disease is SLE. Well, I guess that's systemic lupus erythematosus, but you have to know that. Ethnicity is given as Asian. Asian is not an ethnicity. And what's even more offensive, you go down to race, you see that the race is given as yellow race, and God knows what that is. I mean, these are really random terms. They're not compliant with any ontology, and it's really hard to figure out what this sample is all about. If someone were to search for SLE, they might find this particular data set, but it's really unlikely if you search for other things that are relevant to this data set, you just wouldn't find them, because the metadata are so terrible for Biosample. In fact, we've looked at Biosample. I can tell you, if you're interested, that 73% of the Boolean metadata values are not true or false. They're terms like non-smoker, former smoker. 26% of the metadata values in Biosample that are supposed to be integers are not integers. They're things like JM52 and PIG. 68% of the metadata entries that are supposed to be terms from biomedical ontologies are not terms from biomedical ontology. I guess that surprises nobody in this group. This is a real problem, because when you want to search Biosample, you can't find the data sets that you're interested in because the metadata don't comport with the ontologies that you were using for the kinds of searches that you anticipate. That's why about 10 years ago, as Bioportal was winding down, we started to work on a system called CEDAR. Cedar is a metadata authoring platform that really allows people to use ontologies in an intelligent way to create standard metadata. So in Cedar, one has the ability to start out by authoring what we call metadata templates. A metadata template gives you a reporting guideline listing the fields that are essential to describe standardized metadata and the ontologies that would be used to create values for those fields. And then there's a metadata acquisition system that allows you to take a template from our template library and to fill in the fields in the template with terms from ontologies and other kinds of entries to create standardized metadata. So what that means is if we have a term from biosample, which might consist of the standard elements that need to be specified to describe a sample in the biosample repository. A biosample human would have a sample name, an organism, a tissue, a sex, an isolate, an age, the kinds of things you saw in that previous ugly metadata record. But the metadata are going to be conformant with standards because they have to be by the way Cedar works. You type in the sample name, the organism will come from the NCBI taxon, the tissue comes from the tissue branch of Uberon, and you can see that the ontology gives you a drop-down menu. You make a selection from the drop-down menu, and basically you're guaranteed to have ontology-compliant metadata that allow you to search for metadata in a way which is much better than the kind of junky metadata that is commonplace in these kinds of repositories. So we can go from a metadata record that looks like this to one which is more standardized because it's created using the Cedar templates from in the first place. Now the argument is we don't need any of that stuff. We can just use ChatGPT. Well, my postdoc, Soumya Sundaram, has done a lot of work in this area. Here's an example of what ChatGPT does to legacy metadata in biosample. You start out with a record that shows you the isolate is TM32. That's probably fine. The age is 67. The biomaterial provider is given. The sex is female. Tissue is lung cancer. Wait a minute. Lung cancer is a diagnosis. Lung cancer is not a tissue. You want to say, well, can ChatGPT fix that up and give us a tissue that's more appropriate than lung cancer? Well, it turns out ChatGPT is a lot of things and does a lot of hallucination. It turns isolate into sample isolate identifier, which is not a term you would search by. It takes age, which is the standard descriptor for the age, and turns it to age of donor. It takes biomaterial provider and turns it to sample contributor. It takes sex and turns it into sex of donor. It takes female and capitalizes it. It takes tissue and turns it into sample tissue. It takes lung cancer, which is obviously not a tissue, and changes it to lung, which is a tissue, I guess, but changes it to lung afflicted with cancer, which is kind of poetic, I guess, but it's not a tissue and not something that someone would search on. So just throwing ChatGPT at an existing metadata record does not give you the ontology terms that you would need to do a standardized search. In fact, what Soumya did was to look at biosample and to look at geo and to look at recall using standard searches with revision of the metadata to see what makes a difference. You'll see in this bluish, purplish element of the histogram what happens when you just use the metadata as it exists in the data set. And the recall for a set of standardized searches was about 0.2. Not much better if you actually give ChatGPT the data dictionary. It gets a smidge better. The only time you get really decent recall is when ChatGPT has access not only to the actual metadata, but also to a Cedar template, which tells ChatGPT what the metadata are supposed to look like. So basically, we're using the Cedar template as a kind of RAG that allows us to do a much better transformation using ChatGPT. Using GPT alone is basically worthless. And it's even more curious when we use Geo. Looking at Geo unassisted gives us really terrible recall, which surprisingly gets worse when you give it Geo's confusing data dictionary. Recall only gets decent and not really all that great when you have the ability of adding to ChatGPT, again, as a RAG, Cedar and the Cedar template for Geo, so you get more information. And so increasingly, I think what we see is that Gen AI is not going to give us everything that we need, but if we can combine Gen AI with standards, particularly standard reporting guidelines and standard ontologies, we're going to be in much better shape. So what can we do about all this mess? Well, I think we have, as a community, need to acknowledge that knowledge engineering is hard. I guess after all, that's why we're at this meeting. And that we do have tools that can make it easier, maybe not necessarily perfect. We have to accept that OWL is not the one ring to rule them all. And in fact, again, when you look at Google Trends, we can see surprisingly that web ontology language has had declining interest over the past 20 years. And maybe that's not all that surprising, but it's something that we have to keep in mind. And we also have to accept that we really need to educate people about the importance of standards for data management. That it's not okay to have metadata in our databases like this that are not searchable, that don't allow us to find the kinds of data sets that we're interested in. In an era when everybody is talking about why data need to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, we're never going to have fair data unless we have ontologies, unless we have reporting guidelines, unless we have the kinds of standards that will allow us to do searches in a reasonable way. That's why we need ontologies. And that's also why we have to recognize that there are standards that are important for this enterprise. They're actually not ontological, that we shouldn't really dismiss. And so, for example, in BioPortal, we are obviously committed to ontologies as a major way by which we make sure that metadata records are coherent, that they're compliant with standards, and that they're searchable. But increasingly, we're spending time recognizing that there are persistent identifiers that don't fall into the domain of any ontology. So if we go to CEDAR right now, you'll notice that in addition to being able to enter information about ontologies as possible values for the terms in a reporting guideline, we can enter ORCIDs, we can enter research organization registry identifiers, we can enter research resource IDs, we can enter PubMed IDs, and these are all valuable persistent identifiers that go beyond ontologies and are a different kind of term that our metadata need to reflect. So, for example, in CEDAR right now, if we wanted to enter information about a study, we could put in the study name. We would be asked to specify the institution, and we could go out to the research organization registry, and we could find out how we would specify the persistent identifier for Stanford University. Cleverly, my team has said, well, they want to put me as a principal investigator. We got to go to ORCID. We can find my ORCID and put that in there. We can get the PubMed ID for publications that have come out of this particular study. Basically, we can recognize a whole set of PIDs that are really important for metadata that are not ontological, but also are really important if we want to ensure that we have a mechanism by which we can search our data sets, find the information we're looking for, and basically have data sets that are fair. So what do I keep hearing? I hear that ontologies are old-fashioned. That's garbage. Ontology languages are too complicated. I think they're just complicated enough. Ontology engineering is not an interesting problem. That's garbage too. Ontologies coerce people to adopt rigid worldviews. Well, that's the idea. Generative AI obviates the need for ontologies. That's simply not true, although I think generative AI is very interesting as a component of building ontologies. Basically, we have to acknowledge for the doubters out there that ontology engineering is hard, but good tools make it easier. That we recognize that OWL is important, that it is incredibly valuable to have a standard, and the world without a standard was completely a mess. But OWL is not necessarily the one ring to rule them all. We recognize that people need to understand that standards have a valuable role to play, and to dismiss standards actually gets us into trouble. And that although we are committed to ontologies, and ontologies are critical for making us able to integrate and interoperate our data sets, to build standard knowledge bases, do a lot of important things. There are lots of standards that are important in our world that are not necessarily ontological, and we have to pay attention to those as well. So let me stop there. Let me see what questions you might have. And let me open up the floor in the last few minutes we have.
Yeah, hi. Anna Maria, I completely agree on what you said, and I heard, and I really live all the theory that you just listed, and I see how people are, looking at the ontology as really a weird thing. Why we should do all this work, all this complicated stuff to use ontology? That sometimes we can use something just, write a code and that's it. We don't need. And so I think one of the main problems is really make people understand the advantage. But on the other hand, I see why people, for example, I'm coming from the clinical domain, and why people are completely fine with using an ICD code without any problem, and they instead have issue on using ontology. Obviously, ICD is not an ontology; it's less complicated, but there is a reason that they see the monetary reason, because insurance, hospital, all these things are kind of pushing for that. So I think that, and all the big system like Epics and all this are going to use that. And so I think what is really is missing, in addition to all the things that you say, education, stuff, I all agree. I think there should be a kind of mandate, because otherwise they will always think, we don't need it. Or on the other hand, be better in mapping to what they have, for example, ICD that is used, and have tools that easily will map or translate to whatever is in ICD to the ontology. Because I think that is it's very complicated to convince people, especially in the clinical side, to use the ontology, even if you explain why, they're all the goods, but they always say, I don't know, why should I do this? It's easy to do it the other way.
That's a really good point. I think in clinical medicine, using ICD and other standard terminologies is, I won't say easy, but there's not much of a fight, because frankly, if you want to get paid, that's what you have to do. And so, although we all talk about physician burnout and all the downsides of what people have to do in order to ensure that their visits get coded appropriately, it happens. What's interesting is that people are wondering, should the sponsors who are supporting biomedical research mandate the use of ontologies and standards? And the argument is, thou shalt is an argument that goes a long way. The best example I can give you comes from the Netherlands, where the Netherlands Organization for Biomedical Health Research and Development, ZONMV, is an organization that during the COVID epidemic recognized the importance of using ontologies and standards for creating metadata that would allow for interoperability, because they recognize that, particularly given the urgency of the COVID epidemic, people would need to be able to compare scientific results quickly. And so ZONMV said, if you want our money, you have to pledge to make your data sets open. You have to put them in open repositories, and you have to annotate them with ontologies and reporting guidelines that were specified in the RFA to which people were applying. And it was really quite remarkable. And they still do this in a number of areas, like strong COVID, antimicrobial resistance, and a few others. But really, it's an example of when they say thou shalt, people follow because they wanted the money. I've talked to folks at NIH when I could talk to them, and the argument has always been, we'll never do that. People will never agree to it in the United States.
Yeah, I know. I was in NIH and the same. You cannot, it requires a mandate. You can suggest, but at least even a good suggestion or pointing to the good tools will be at least, good. But yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so I saw Magdalene, you raise your hand. Magdalene, she's from France, and she works with some ontology work with food, I think, right? And she's also in the RDA FAIR mapping working group. Please unmute yourself and ask your question to Mark.
Thank you, Asia. Nice for the introduction. Hi, nice to meet you, Mark. I have a question. I totally agree with your demonstration that we can reuse ontologies for metadata and interoperability. But I just wondering, you don't really need ontologies to have some control vocabulary, right? So I was just wondering if you are using the relation also, because now we are just putting some tags on entities, but what about the relations? Are you using them at the end or not? Because in your example of metadata, it's just control vocabulary. That's already good, but what about the reasoning?
We are creating standard metadata in Cedar with the idea that these will be annotating data sets that will go into repositories that others will reason about. So our team is not doing that kind of reasoning, but for sure, we think that's why we're in this business, because we want to have descriptions of data that human users can find, but also that autonomous agents can locate and reason about. That's really where we're going. Ultimately, we're very excited about the idea of autonomous agents being able to reason about scientific results and to plan new experiments and summarize experiments and all that good stuff. We also recognize that a lot, again, I didn't say it in my talk, but it's pretty obvious that in addition to ontologies, a lot of value sets are critical for standardizing metadata, and those are available through BioPortal as well.
And so just to be sure to understand well, the use of LLM ontologies combined to, it's more the template, the structure you offer to LLM that guides them to understand correctly the metadata, right?
Exactly. We find that LLMs without that structure are useless.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Next is Oliver. Oliver, please show your, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Mark. Yeah, that's great to hear your talk. Yeah, very inspirational. So I want to ask a question related to the relation between AI and ontology. So like as you said, right? Like in terms of the question, like how with AI, why we need ontology? Actually, I had the same like a problem. I mean, people asking me the questions, right? Because I'm an ontologist. They say, "Oh, we have AI, genetic AI. Why we need ontology?" So my answer, like what you said, right? I say, okay, for like LLM or like machine learning, right? It's more like a black box. So when people you give a question, an input, and they give you answer, but they never tell you the mechanism. But I think ontology can give you a mechanism. And so usually people are fine with it. So I'm kind of thinking a little bit more. And then how can we get some good demonstrations on this one? So my question actually for you is like, how can we possibly demonstrate if we can better use ontology for deeper mechanistic study?
Yeah, I think this is an area that a lot of people are starting to look at. I'm really excited by the work that my postdoc has done, as I showed you. I think that it really boils down to the fact that people, are still have that glare in their eye because some of what LLMs do is so dazzling that you have to remember that everything they know is what they've learned from someplace on the web somewhere, and that if we want to have data that are structured in a consistent way, we can't just randomly take stuff on the web. We can't allow an LLM to tell us that our tissue is lung afflicted with cancer, because no one is ever going to search for that, and no reason is ever going to know what that means. So I think the argument that we have to make to people is that, yes, we can see amazing results that make sense to people who understand natural language. But there are lots of reasons that we want to have descriptions of things in the world that are not necessarily comporting with natural language, but that are structured in a way that automated reasoners can do stuff with them. And I think that's where ontologies are going to be essential. That's why ontologies are critical for search, where they're important for automated reasoning. And I think we just have to just keep on showing that things fail when you rely totally on generative AI. And I think Somia's paper is a good example of that.
I see. Great. Yeah, thank you.
Next, Alex.
Yes, hi, Mark. Really great talk. And yeah, I think I think it's, we've been seeing example after example of how when you add ontology as part of, for instance, a RAG model to LLMs, it really can tremendously improve the output of that LLM in terms of reasoning. We have an example of that at Buffalo where Peter Elkin has created, and his group have created an LLM that was trained with triples from various sources online, or various ontologies and structured sources, terminologies that he says outperforms any commercial LLM on standard medical student tests, for instance.
You got to send me that paper.
Okay, yeah, it was recently published. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, my point is that together, hopefully, we can do so much more with the combination, and I think that's something we need to stress, is that as you point out, LLMs can be trained on anything they find, but if you provide a knowledge backbone that, for instance, ontology can provide, it really strengthens the ability of the LLM perhaps to avoid some degree of hallucination and so on. The other point I would make is that, obviously we've seen the tremendous success of the gene ontology that persists 25 years after its founding, where the papers that are published on the gene ontology, the routine update papers, get 50 citations a month, and that indicates people are clearly using this technology. We have, for instance, the cell ontology, which is more in use now than ever before in its history because of single-cell RNA sequencing, and it's been adopted as the standard by that community, and that's really been something wonderful. Some of us have worked on that ontology for 20 years. To see the work we did in 2005, 2008 in use, it proves the value of the knowledge that we built into the ontology. And I think maybe that's a subtle measure of success, but it's really something that has enabled this community, this fairly large community of single-cell researchers, to really provide us or use a standard where they can link their results together.
I agree with your perspective. I mean, Alex, the thing that strikes me is that, and I'm going to be using a broad generalization, but the AI community as it exists now thinks it's a sign of weakness to actually use available knowledge to do anything interesting. The self-driving car community wants to learn how to drive the car everywhere without necessarily being primed with rules of the road, which might make it actually useful. The cell ontology has a lot of valuable information, and the idea of having to learn all that anew because you don't want to rely on existing sources doesn't make any sense, when actually in reality those LLMs are learning their stuff from existing sources, just in a very implicit, indirect, and unknowable way. So yes, I think we really have to work hard with our colleagues who do pure AI, if that's the right word, to develop more hybrid systems that bring together the kind of stuff that we do in our community with the kind of work that is going on in the AI community. And at the same time, when it comes to hard tasks like knowledge engineering, know that AI can help us in our work as well. I think there's a real opportunity for collaboration, and we need to recognize that it is not a sign of weakness to draw on someone else's methods.
Yeah, so thank you. So I want to add something about this. I think everybody, this topic is in everybody's mind, thinking of how LLM and ontology. In the beginning, I think people do think, oh, I can use LLM to create ontology, but I have seen a couple of submissions, especially they couldn't create a satisfying ontology. And I encouraged the authors, I said, if it doesn't work, please report your failure result. I don't know what that's, how will them present that. I'm looking forward to it. But my point is that I have been on a learning course about generative AI. When they talk about advanced RAG. They were talking about using a structured prompt or using a metadata to provide more context, so the LLM can give more answers. What I see is like, wow, that is ontology. So the LLM and ontology has to go hand in hand. And I fully agree with you, Mark. We should, as our community, we should go more to interact with other groups, for example, Pure AI group. And for example, next year, that's why next year we want to host the meeting with ISMB. They have a special interest group for open bioinformatics resource software, and the also bioontology knowledge representation group. And this year, the ICBO East actually hosts co-located with the ISWO, held it in Japan. So moving forward, we do need to, because and I want to comment about why the investors do not want to put money into ontology anymore. So during my year with the NIH, I can hear that all the times. It's the goal's success is also the failure of the other projects, because NIH I think over 10 years, they at least put $5 million to produce this gene ontology, but NIH felt that we still need to continuously support this. Where is this maintenance coming? Maintenance cost is high, right? Therefore, and the investor likes to chase something new. So now the LLM is new. Therefore, everybody wants to go that way, that route. But as we said, that LLM cannot do things that is more specific. They are general. The specific knowledge is coded in the ontology. Yes, I agree it's really hard, but we have to move the strategy. So through my work, consulting work with industry, what I see is that industry is actually picking up ontology quite, moving at a fast way to adopt ontology use from whatever we delivered here. Of course, they will do their modification, but what industry did, the concept of industry and research is different, because they have their key business focus, and their key business focus moves really fast. Therefore, the tool that can facilitate ontology use is very important. We cannot develop ontology without delivering any tool. That is also another reason I said that we have to give a lot of to allow people to submit just some talks with tools. And the people who develop tools, they are not going to submit a formal research paper. Usually they submit conference proceedings and they move on. Right? So I have a lot more to say, but I see that there are other people wants to talk too. Go ahead, Anna Maria.
Yeah, just want to shout out what you say about I was going to say about the industry, and I see that these two industry are mostly going into ontology because, as you said, I think they see the value of getting better results in lower time, and that's our money for them, and so they go and they see the advantage and they use it. That's what we on the research side, I don't think we are looking in that direction, but I think it should be, more understanding exactly, learning now from the industry why they're using ontology. So are they crazy or what? Or there is really a good in using ontology? And I think they will learn that. And we need to kind of more publicize that too, because is always, because I still see that the problem is people do not want to use it. We can create the best ontology in the world, but that is my experience. They are looking at me like, and then what is so, as all the thing that Mark said, it's so complicated. I don't have a tool to use it. It's complicated for me. This owl language is weird. I don't know how to do it. Why is not Python? Why is not that? And so all these things are the ones that stop them by using and do something wrong, but easy to do it, especially, as I said, in the clinical side where they have clinical data every day that they need to deal with. And so they do not have too much time to, work on. And so that's, I think, having the tools, I agree, is another thing that is missing, a tool that can be used every time that we think about an ontology and the use of that ontology. How can we use that? What we can do to facilitate the use? And then obviously the education has been said, because people make a big confusion with ontology, terminology, coding, all the stuff.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes left. I want to ask who else wants to add more to this. Oh, I saw Christina shared. Okay, John, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Felt like I was a little bit in history land there for a second. I just wanted to comment on, I think, the huge value that's represented by what's really linked data as much as is ontologies, which is the inclusion of all of the authoritative resources as field types in CEDAR. I think that's what you start to see when you're really trying to build the complex model of relationships in the systems and the metadata. And so I'm really excited to see those things come up for the modeling that in fact I have to do on the project I'm involved with. It's going to make that model look so much better. So yeah, I hope that general model of interoperability is one that can be supported to, as you say, OWL is great, but I think it's not just OWL. I think the SCOS helps, and I think these other authoritative sources of identifiers are also critically important to really make the entire ecosystem as smart as possible.
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate that. Our biggest frustration, of course, is that each one of these external authorities, which give us PIDs for all kinds of things, are all one-offs. There is
different interface every time.
Every single API is different. So it takes us a fair amount of work to bring in each one, but I think it's an important thing for us to do. And I think as a community, we need to recognize that ontologies are not everything.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. I mean, it's 1 p.m. now, and we have a mirror board. If you have more thoughts, sometimes we have more thoughts after the discussion. So please share your thoughts on the mirror board. And I want to say that, Mark, I want to involve you for the future. After the conference, we will still host a discussion session to just think about the future, what we should do. I think we had touched base on a lot of directions. But as a community, we should stick together and come together to find out some really like what the use cases that can solve a bigger problem to involve AI industry and everything. Yeah.
Thanks. And thanks so much for inviting me today. And also before we go, I should let everyone know, I did tell my scientific advisory board that they were wrong.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you. So we will reconvene in 10 minutes. We will, who is Anwat? Yeah, Anwat will present. After Anwat will be Wana. Thank you. See you in 10 minutes.